Hey folks, it's Mark here and welcome to the very first episode of the FEX Insights podcast. We're going to cover very interesting things from the news to bringing on guests to going into deep dives in education that you really need to know if you're an institution or you're a trader or just like interested in blockchain and the technology that it provides. You might hear all the hype about crypto, but there's far more to it than that. So we'll start off with the news. Welcome back, folks, and this is the news segment of the show for May the 23rd, 2025. So first of all, we had institutional adoption in Bitcoin soar the price of a Bitcoin asset to $110,000. So there was a lot of spot trading in terms of ETFs. There was a lot of regulatory clarity, and a weaker US dollar has notably seen the prices increase. There's a lot of great analysts out there from like Real Vision. CoinDesk has some great stuff, so definitely check that out. Over in Texas, so to the Lone Star State, they've got the Senate passing a bill that effectively gives them a strategic Bitcoin reserve. So following on from other states and what the national government is doing. What does that mean for businesses? What does it mean for government departments? As well as the just fervent belief that this is the asset of the future over there. So really interesting stuff. In other news, we also saw a merger with Standard Chartered and Falcon X collaborate on institutional crypto services. So they partnered together with crypto brokerage firm Falcon X. So Standard Chartered are doing great things out there. We know the folks from Singapore, Renee Michaud, John Ho, regulars at Aussie international kind of events. And, you know, the next move, which is bringing Falcon X into the work that they do around banking, Forex services, and all that kind of stuff to institutional clients. So this is set to enhance settlement efficiency and reduce operational risks for large-scale crypto investors. So check out this news article on that. Another interesting thing is that 83% of institutions plan to increase crypto allocations. This is a little bit older news from earlier this year, but I think it's important to note, especially as we start off this podcast. If you are in that institutional space, the efficiencies that you get from blockchain, it's not just capital formation, but there's the other side of things, which is where you will get the efficiencies, the gains, the benefits that come from the technology. Right. So we're going to hear more about that with our special guest on later on, as well as for the educational part of this segment. Now over to the regulatory landscape and looking at some global shifts there. So we see the US Senate advances what they call the Genius Act for stablecoin regulation. They progressed the act. It's a bill that's aimed at establishing a federal regulatory framework for stablecoins. This legislation mandates that reserve disclosures and one-to-one backing with liquid assets, aiming to enhance consumer protection and financial stability. So by having that at that high level, it just seems to support what the various institutions, businesses and startups that are creating things using stablecoins will be able to do in the US. And hopefully when the US catches this cold, Australia is going to sneeze as well. Over to Hong Kong, we see that they have passed also a landmark stablecoin bill. So following on from the US, the Hong Kong legislature has approved a significant stablecoin bill. They've created a licensing framework for fiat reference stablecoin issuers. This move is part of Hong Kong's strategy to position itself as a global hub for digital assets. For more of that news, read this Reuters article. And then over to the UK, and the HMRC have basically introduced new crypto tax reporting rules. So starting in January 2026, they're going to require that crypto holders provide detailed personal and transaction data aiming to enhance tax compliance over there. So if you are holding crypto, be prepared for the changes coming in the new year. And then finally, over to Australia, there was a landmark ruling according to the AFR and major news outlets in terms of crypto tax and how that may mean that the government has to pay back because they tax folks that may not necessarily need to have been taxed. There is much more detail and devil in the detail when it comes to that. So shown here on screen as you're watching, not just the news article that highlighted this, but also some other articles and LinkedIn posts from people that work in this space that are crypto tax experts and lawyers that give their opinions. I highly suggest that you look at these details there before you jump the gun and expect millions of dollars back, depending on what position you're in. But really an important piece to look into, and certainly something that you can dive into with these articles. All right, welcome back to the first guest. And, I thought I wouldn't go too far from home. I work at NotCentralised, but hey, let's just keep it centralized in terms of getting the first guest for the FEX Insights podcast. We do this new thing, which is it's new because you haven't had this podcast before, but it's all about guest interviews. We're speaking to people that are from this space, that are working at the intersection of things like blockchain and institutional finance. Arturo, could you give us a bit of a background about you? What led you to be right here, sitting where you are now?
Well, I was told.
First of all,
right?
Yeah,
it was on my calendar. But I was pretty nerdy. I started doing math at uni, and
crazy.
then I started working as a quant at the Royal Bank of Scotland right before everything happened in
This
London.
is before ChatGPT, right?
Yeah, far before that. It was an interesting journey because I ended up running the institutional and retail business for the Nordics with regards to structured products. So it was quant, then sales, trading, and structuring. So that was kind of the journey towards getting into deep institutional finance. I moved over then to Merrill Lynch, also in London, doing the same thing, but mostly focused on creating systematic trading strategies that we then put into structured products. And then once I left, it was always very tech focused. So I did fintech for a while, and then a number of years later, blockchain kind of fell on the map. And
Like fintech, like building apps and
yeah, correct. So it was all about systematizing and learning about why the way we did things within the banks actually worked quite well in the bigger scheme of things. They're very efficient beasts, even if you don't believe so.
People only see the surface level on the
Yeah.
outside. They don't see just how much is going on underneath. It's actually quite impressive when you look at it, right?
And there's a big difference between investment banks that run really complex risk and then the commercial banks that most people effectively engage with, which are loans and payments and so forth. So on the investment banking side, it's extremely tech driven, and it just makes things much more efficient. So that was kind of like the learning that was then applied across other fintech solutions, and effectively what brought me into really appreciating the value of blockchain.
Yeah, I mean, as you say, we've come together to work quite a bit, and whenever we look at like a situation, it's like, yep, we can do that, or like maybe, but it's always like the devil is in the detail, and there's a lot of detail when it comes to this kind of stuff. So it's exciting that we have blockchain and all this transformational things, but to get it integrated into the real world applications, whether it's finance or other industries, there's a lot more detail there, and people, I think, are coming to appreciate that. Especially going to my next question, it's like the institutions, like they're starting to adopt and embrace, or even just research and look at, like blockchain. So what are you kind of seeing there? Why do you think that that's starting to happen now?
Well, I think that the short answer is that people are starting to understand the value of the efficiency gains that you get from a blockchain, because I did start the conversation saying that institutional trading is very tech efficient. That's a nuanced statement, right? It's about the difference between how they run things internally and then also how they connect to other parties like exchanges and other banks and so forth. And that interconnectivity layer is actually not particularly efficient. And these inefficiencies are, for example, needing to wait 2 days for settlement on equities, or having to reconcile a lot of information that is supposed to be the same information across different data sets, or more specifically coming from different institutions, right? So you and I did a trade. We need to reconcile that we actually did what we said that we were going to do, and that reconciliation happens at multiple stages. And all of that is really clunky. And blockchain actually makes a lot of this communication infinitely more efficient.
Yeah, I think it does. And there's that there's definitely, like with any technology, because we do stuff in the AI space as well, there's the fear mongering on the one side, and then there's the hype on the other, and it's usually somewhere in the middle that things sit. But just speaking of, one of the trends, and it kind of leads into the hype because we see good versions of this and kind of like the fake versions of it, but the concept of tokenizing everything. What are your thoughts on that? Because like all of a sudden it's like, hey, RWAs everywhere, let's tokenize everything and stuff. But pragmatically, it doesn't actually make sense to tokenize everything. What are your thoughts?
I think that the cleanest definition of what tokenization means is that you have a legal agreement that allows you to represent an obligation or a right or ownership as blockchain primitives, right? So let's, for example, say that I have an invoice and that invoice is represented as an NFT. When I send you that invoice, when you see the legal agreement, let's say, that you're agreeing to, then you can see that, well, okay, then this is the address for that token. And I can then trace, what happens with the agreement by tracing the token.
Yeah.
If the legal agreement is not in place or doesn't allow for let's call it token mechanics, then you're not tokenizing. You're just having a digital representation on a blockchain of that thing, right? So if we take something, and I'm saying something because again, it could be an asset or an obligation, and that something has a legal agreement, then you can just redraft that slightly and make it token friendly, so you're tokenizing. But if that thing doesn't have that legal agreement in place, then you can't tokenize by just representing it as a token. You actually need to start with the legals, then the token representation, and then it works. So the concept of just saying, well, I'm tokenizing this phone, right? Unless there is some form of asset register and let's call it legal acceptance that the owner of this token is also therefore the owner of the phone, then you're not actually doing anything. You're just playing with tokens, right?
We could tokenize this house, but like if it's not recognized by, say, the land registries or like the institutes and organizations that manage who owns what house, then or apartment, it's going to be nothing really. It's just like you said, it's a digital representation. That is one thing, but I think another thing to think about is just like, what's the point? Because one part might be capital formation. It might be, you want to introduce new types of liquidity into it, but that should not be the only thing that you look at when it comes to tokenization. And I fear that if you just chase only that and not look at the other efficiencies the blockchain provides, it's going to be a bit of a fool's errand potentially, or it might work, but you run a higher risk of failure. I mean, the efficiency side is also important, right?
Look, bootstrapping liquidity is a very, very difficult task to achieve on its own. So imagine creating an exchange or creating a market. By definition, you need to have many people on that engaging with that market for that to work. Even if you have a market, to list a product on that market doesn't mean automatically that people will trade on it. Right? So these two things are what I call bootstrapping liquidity. So I think that one of the problems that people have when going into the tokenization game is that they think that it naturally becomes this form for accessing capital or liquidity that just magically works. And it doesn't, because it's not magical. It's just better technology. So the way that we approach things is that we will tokenize if we think that there's a value chain that already has, let's call it, natural investment and natural deployment. And we can represent, or rather make that money move and make the assets move within that value chain more efficiently. Because that's something that is more in your control, since you know who the parties are. And you're getting all these parties in the value chain to agree to now start transacting using this platform instead of that old platform. as opposed to hoping to move, 1,000 different people that are unknown from a market A to market B. Like that's actually really hard.
Yeah, massively. And it's a lot that people need to understand, that the process of, I mean, we're talking about blockchain here, but it's any kind of change of system. That's effectively what we're trying to do. Any change managers out there would realize, and I mean, would be the first to tell you just how difficult that is from a cultural perspective, from a technology perspective, and even just from a business objectives kind of perspective, that it's multiple things that may clash. So always best to start off with experiments. And speaking of, there's a big experiment that we can talk about the things that are public information there, but the RBA, let's take it back to 2023 and then back to now 2025. The RBA did pilot projects, and we were lucky enough to participate in that for construction payments. Can you tell folks that might not remember that, or they're just new to this space, what was that about?
So in 2023, the RBA ran a project which was called, I think it was the Australian CBDC pilot.
Yeah.
And the purpose of that pilot was to understand how do you effectively deploy or create an obligation by the central bank as a token on a blockchain. So a lot of that work was effectively legal work to understand how do you even structure it. So it was less of a technology question. It was more of a holistic kind of infrastructure, both legal and technological to a certain extent. But the technology was actually quite simple, because what they did was deploy onto a private EVM chain that they controlled, and you couldn't deploy smart contracts onto that chain.
Yep.
So it was really just an ERC20 that was transferred between different participants, effectively different banks, and then we had to bridge that token over to another chain where we could deploy smart contracts. And specifically what we did was just show how you can use smart contracts to create escrows within construction payments to show that there is money in the system. And it was a really interesting one, because we did a particularly small transaction by design. I think it was around $20,000.
About that, yeah.
And then it was 2 or 3 different escrows, which is unheard of, because you would never escrow even for $20,000. But here we had like $5,000 escrows at no cost.
Why wouldn't people escrow at that level?
Oh, because it's so clunky and it's expensive, right? You need to set up. You have to have relationships with either lawyers or trusts, or however you're going to do it. There are many ways of doing escrows, but none of them are simple.
Yeah.
Right. And this is what blockchain showed us, that it could be really, really simple.
Yeah. And the other part of that came out during the actual pilot was that, okay, commercial confidentiality gets lost if you just use blockchains just natively, because they've got that transparency feature. Like you and I do a deal, you can see all my transactions. They're OX ETH addresses, but I can see yours. So margins that get given away. Like, what did we do there?
Yeah, it's funny. I think that this is one of the things that you learn that are actually quite specific to crypto, right? Because in crypto, people don't care or cared about confidentiality. Like, that was part of the ethos. Let's just make everything transparent. And you could think, well, I mean, there's a lot of money in crypto. Some people have made a lot, others have lost a lot, but nevertheless, it's something that works.
Yeah.
So therefore, we can apply it to let's just say to the real world, right? But that's just not the way things work, right? Crypto effectively started with a bunch of degens saying, well, it would be cool to do this thing. And it starts off as a research project, and then more and more people pile into it, and they say, well, let's just put in a little bit of money. But at the end of the day, it's a game. It starts like a game, and the game becomes bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger. But at the end of the day, it's a game.
Yep.
Right. So it's really hard, even for us, right, that we've been doing TradFi for a long time. We've been playing with crypto, to not see that difference. But it's with pilots like these where you really, where reality hits you, and all of a sudden you're sitting in front of customers and you're telling them, or you think that you're going to tell them that, yeah, your invoices are visible and your payments are visible, and therefore your margins are also visible, right? And you're like, wow, that actually, I can't say that. That doesn't work. So we had to quickly learn how to deploy, write our own circuits in Circom using zero-knowledge proofs to obfuscate the transactions and actually make it feasible for traditional businesses to use it, because they don't really care about blockchain. And for them, they want it to work. And what work means is not that I get to have my transaction instantly settle. It's that I can run my business and I need to have privacy within that business.
I can keep, it's like the best of both worlds. They get the programmability on one side, and then they get the commercial confidentiality that they're used to in the current world. So I think bringing those two together is interesting. And fast forwarding to now, like, there's limited stuff that we can say, obviously, because the announcements haven't gone out. But what is the RBA looking to test right now?
So a few years later, 3 years later, the RBA comes out again and they say, we're going to do Project Acacia. And Project Acacia is, I would say, a continuation of the CBDC pilot, but in a slightly different direction, where the direction is not understanding what a CBDC is or how you work with it. In principle, it's more about understanding how tokenized economies work and how the RBA can support a tokenized economy. So in this, let's call it pilot scope, there were a number of different supported mechanisms, which some of them actually did not involve a CBDC at all. It would just involve the MPP, for example.
The National Payments Platform for the
new payments platform. Great name. The interesting thing with this pilot is that it's effectively the RBA coming out and saying, well, look, we believe in tokenization. We see that things are happening in the world. How do we best support it? And obviously there is a CBDC involved, and that's a really big thing. It's a wholesale CBDC. But nevertheless, I think that it's important to clarify that it's not about the CBDC, it's about tokenized economies. And we submitted a proposal where we are securitizing the entire flow from invoice generation to create an asset-backed security that holds these invoices as collateral. And then a token linked to this ABS gets listed on an exchange, and we're effectively connecting investment capital from the capital markets all the way down to people that need to have some working capital on the other side of the spectrum. Which is that's what happens today. It's just really expensive. It takes a long time to get there, and the investors never really get to see what happens at the invoice level.
It's not visible, right?
Correct.
There's no kind of line of sight there, and there's already, like you're saying, that it's a very sophisticated process, but we're adding efficiency into it. And as we said before, that efficiency kind of play, this is where blockchain really gets to shine.
And let's be clear that it's about auditability. And sure, you can achieve auditability in the traditional space, but it's not real-time auditability. And there are many parties that you need to trust throughout the way across everything, right? While as with blockchain, we've shown that with confidentiality, you can actually not necessarily have full transparency, but you can in real time verify that things are happening, and you can request proofs that something has happened, because you can see that there's a transaction. You don't see exactly what the transaction is, but you can ask someone to mathematically prove that this transaction pertains to X, Y, and Z, and that's what that real-time auditability achieves. And furthermore, it's actually not only about auditability, but it's about permissioning. Right. So you can set up an asset-backed security, which is effectively a trust that, let's say, in this case, buys invoices into their pool, And through the smart contracts, you can actually almost encode encode the logic so that the asset-backed security can only accept assets or invoices of a specific nature, so that let's say the structure remains or continues to have a specific credit risk or certain properties that you want that investment to have. So you kind of have that compliance by design built in, which is, that's something new.
I think people are going to see a lot more of that when the RBA does the announcement. We'll bring you back on to talk more about that. But for being the first guest, Arturo, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Welcome back, folks. This is another piece of the FEX Insights podcast, and we're going to do this each week where we dive into relevant topics related to, in this case, deep dives. So one of the first things that we want to look at today, and I've got Arturo on here as a guest, is derivatives 2.0. So why institutions are turning to digital asset markets. So Arturo, welcome back.
Thank you.
So first of all, can you explain to folks that might not know what are digital asset derivatives?
I think that first people need to understand what a derivative is.
Absolutely.
Right.
Yeah.
And a derivative is nothing more than a contractual obligation that is linked to an underlying asset. So, for example, you have the standard call option, right, which is an agreement where I will, for example, sell you an option, so you effectively have the right to purchase an asset from me at a specific price. Right? So that's just a contractual agreement. There are mechanics to the agreement. So when we think about, let's call it a derivative in blockchain space, then effectively what we're doing is that we're just encoding those rules for what we have agreed to at the smart contract level, right? So you would ask, well, why is that important? Or, what's good with that? What's good is basically that it becomes it's almost like a booking system, right?
Okay.
We've agreed that this is going to happen. You'd need to go into your system and say, I have agreed to buy this and this and this, and then you need to monitor it and price it and so forth. I kind of need to do the same thing on my end as the seller, but if we use smart contracts, then we have this unified kind of source of truth, this unified ledger where it's booked. You can see that I've booked it correctly. I can, do the things that I need to do. We have the transparency, and at maturity, you get whatever it is that you're supposed to get, right?
I think it's really interesting because what we're seeing in the market at the moment is that like these digital asset derivatives are becoming more of an entry point into the space rather than, say, tokenized assets or spot assets. What do you think derivatives offer that more friendly kind of way, it seems?
I think it's because tokenizing an asset is actually more difficult than tokenizing a right or an obligation.
Okay.
Because I think that the extreme example here is real estate, right?
Yeah. Yep.
It's a good one because most countries will have a specific land register or some form of an asset register, which, contrary to contract law, is actually dependent on a technology, and that technology is not a blockchain, right? So it becomes really clunky. So I can tokenize the real estate, but if I'm going to transfer that real estate to you, transferring the token means nothing, right? And we're specifically talking about ownership of the real estate, not a lien on the real estate or a unit trust on the real estate or something like that, right? Therefore, tokenizing or representing as a token this unit trust or this derivative, which is really just a contract, and we can structure that contract however we want, right? It's up to us. It's a bi-party transaction. It's a bilateral transaction. So we write the legals in such a way that enable us to represent the obligations in token form. We deploy those tokens or those smart contracts, and we're done, right? As opposed to needing to change the infrastructure for how a country deals with land titles, for example.
That's interesting, and it speaks to that point of like, and this is part of the education that we've seen, and it's nice to be really fervent in your belief that hey, there's going to be these new systems. Everyone needs to move to blockchain. But then the reality sets in when people have tried some basic things on blockchain and go, oh crap, that doesn't work, right? So this concept of bringing the blockchain technology into existing workflows is better because it's meeting in the middle ground, but it's also like a lot harder than people realize as well because there's so much nuance when it comes to the detail. A lot of people just see, oh, government's inefficient, banks are inefficient, that process is inefficient. There's so many multiple kind of reasons why, and I think people don't ask why enough, but we're starting to see that kind of change. Let's talk about like the skepticism that people might have in this space. So they might think that this is purely for price action, this is purely for speculation, it's to leverage stuff. There's more to it than that. What would you have to say to skeptics?
They lack imagination.
Yeah. First of all, yeah.
Lack curiosity as well. And it's like having a conversation about not believing in a specific technology, right? When you say that I don't believe in this thing, it's not a religion,
yeah,
right? It's not saying that technology is not stating a fact or making a statement that you need to either agree to or disagree to. The technology is just a tool, right?
Yeah.
So I guess that what people are talking about and they're conflating is the difference between the belief in a technology and the belief in the value of how people are using that technology, right? So people can agree or disagree with crypto. I think that it's very easy to focus on the negatives of crypto.
Yep.
But even in that, there's learnings that are actually really, really valuable, right? So the world is a different place because of crypto. And we could see that in the bigger scheme of things. Like we have the US now focusing on stable coins quite strongly and the way that that's actually going to be changing financial markets. So for good or bad, crypto has made many, many changes. We've learned a lot from that.
Yep.
So saying that you don't believe in it, like it doesn't really make sense.
Or saying like the technology is good or bad, it's like it's the use of it. It's like how certainly blockchains are not for everything. There's got to be this pragmatism and stuff, and we see it in the AI space. It's funny. It's a reflection. I think they're lucky in AI that blockchains come first because a lot of the lessons from the overhype on the one side, but fear mongering on the other, which doesn't lead to anything, but it's that pragmatic middle where you actually figure out how can it actually work and where does it make sense in this scenario. So it's really interesting kind of stuff there. So skeptics be warned. The next part is like on the legacy versus digital. What do you think makes a good derivatives market, and how do crypto, let's call them blockchain native systems, differ from traditional markets like we normally see? Like if they're driven by blockchain, what do these markets kind of look like?
So to have a good market, there are many properties that need to exist. You need to have fair and orderly dynamics. You need to have access to the right information, and more importantly, you need to be able to trust that what you see is real.
Yeah.
And that when you expect for something to happen, that it actually does happen, right? So here we're talking about the let's call it the truth behind the data feeds, and also the settlement risk, so that when you expect to have closed a transaction, that it actually closes and it settles. So in the derivatives market, you have a further complication, which is not a thing of the market itself, but it's more about the participants, and it's about actually following the rules of what happens when you have closed that transaction, right? Because it is an obligation. And the nice thing with smart contracts is that it doesn't solve everything, but it definitely addresses each one of these points, right?
Yeah.
It gives you the ability to have better trust over what is being traded, so the data feeds.
Yep.
And it also gives you the more trust in the fact that you're actually settling the transaction because of atomic settlement.
Yep.
And finally, it also gives you more trust in knowing that the execution or the life cycle of the contract, if it's done properly, can be trusted because it's more efficient.
This sounds much more pragmatic. This sounds more on the boring side of crypto, but the necessary side of things, because it's not about the price action, but it's about actually having efficient systems. And the call to action for a lot of folks is to actually look at this side, ignore the hype, ignore the fear mongering, actually look at what these things are doing. And it's great that the RBA is going to do something. There's many other examples from the banks doing stuff out there. Our friends at Red Belly Network are doing some great stuff. So watch their Red Belly Insights podcast, where I'm the host there as well. But please do check this stuff out. Arturo, thank you for the insights.
Thank you.